ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Rochelle Riley. How y'all doing? So, I'm going to tell you a story about invoices. Once upon a time, in the state of North Carolina, which is one of the most racist states in America, to this day, there was a county called Edgecombe County, and it's still there. It is the home of my hometown, Tarboro, North Carolina. There were 10,000 people there when I grew up. There are 10,000 people there now. But that wonderful little town was where my growing up house is, or at least where it was until Hurricane Floyd drowned it. And it was the home of the man that I call Pawpaw. Pawpaw was my grandfather. He raised my brother and sister and me as a duty to my mother because she contracted multiple sclerosis and could not do it. She was married to a man. Yeah, I guess he's a man. They were college sweethearts. She was a debutante, Delta Sigma Theta sorority sister. And he was a basketball star and a chemistry major. They got married. They had a lovely little life. They moved to New York. He fell in love with a white woman. She contracted multiple sclerosis. My grandmother, as Southern matriarchs are wont to do, got on a train, came and got her child and her 3 children and took us back to North Carolina. And that's where Pawpaw took care of everybody. I didn't really know him because he wasn't the type of person that you got to know. He was a gruff person. He was loving, but he was gruff. He was caring, but he was gruff. He was direct and very gruff. Some people called him mean, and that's because he was mean. His name was Mr. Willie Benny Pitt. And everybody in my hometown, black and white, called him Mr. Benny Pitt. And he called every young woman, gal, and every man and boy, Charlie. Mr. Alec Davis, our neighbor across the street, would come out of his house. Hi, Mr. Benny Pitt. Hey, Charlie. Every boyfriend I ever had, every man in our neighborhood, the guys who made deliveries, the men he worked with, they were all Charlie. But he was Mr. Benny Pitt. And it didn't dawn on me for years why that was until I realized when I got a little older and a little smarter, that was his way of being respected. In a little town in a racist state where white men still called black men boy. No one ever did that to my grandfather because he was Mr. Benny Pitt. So back in 1977, when Alex Haley discovered his roots, and it was before anybody questioned his roots, and we were all excited about his roots, and we watched television about roots, I decided that I needed to know my history. I had to know what came before. So I would dog my grandfather. I would follow him around like the little reporter that I would become and say, Pawpaw, tell me about your family. Tell me about your dad. And he'd say, go on now. Swat me away like a gnat. But it didn't stop me. I did it over and over again, and it was not until 1988. Now, you know I said 1977 in Roots. 1988, I was a reporter at the Washington Post. I'd driven home for the weekend, caught him in a good mood on the front porch of our growing-up house. Now, our growing-up house was a shotgun house. If you stood at the front door, and every time somebody came to the house, the door was never locked. You just say, "Coming in." Open the door, and you could see from the front door all the way to the back door. You walk down that long hallway, bedroom, bath, and the kitchen. Well, he was sitting on the front porch, and I didn't even go in the house. My grandmother was back in the kitchen. I didn't even go back because he was sitting there smoking a cigar. I said, okay, this is my moment. I'm going to catch him right now before I even go in the house. I said, Pawpaw, please, please, it's so important to me. Tell me about your family. Who was your daddy? Nathan. Who was his daddy? Ad. Well, who was his daddy? Balaam. Pay dirt. That was like a neon sign to enslavement. I said, okay, now I'm getting somewhere. Tell me about Balaam and tell me about Ad. I don't know about Balaam, but Ad, Nathan used to plant in the bend of the river where we grew up. That's all they did all the time, plant. They worked land that wasn't theirs and just planted. I said, well, what did you do? He said, I planted until I got tired, and then I left. And I was the only one to leave. Nobody else ever left. And I said, well, Pawpaw, was Balaam a slave? Gone now. And he got up, stubbed out his cigar, and walked in the house. It would take another few months of asking and pleading and talking to him, and he would never say another word about Balaam. Except one time when I asked him, did Balaam have somebody? And he said, Jane. And I immediately thought of the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, and I'm like, oh, but wait a minute, Miss Pitt, so that's not right. But I was a full-fledged reporter then. I know how to do my job. I went to the North Carolina State Archives, and I asked this woman, who of course, this is North Carolina, she was white, and I said, I'm looking for my great-great-grandfather. And she said, oh, and I said, yes, he'll probably be in some tax records or some property records. And she went, oh. Death certificates, tax records. I went through the death certificates. It didn't take 2 hours to find a death certificate for Balaam Pitt, married to Jane. And there was a little reference number, index number for me to go somewhere else. So I went over to the tax records, and there in the tax records of an attorney named W.S. Pitt from a century before was a listing of his property. And there was Balaam and wife Jane and what they were worth. So I took all of my little documents because I felt like I'd found something. I wasn't going to get back to the Gambia and a drum and anything in Africa, but I had that. And I went back and I told my grandmother and I told my aunt. There were only 2 sisters, my aunt, the older, who was very proper, very educated, and my mom. So I went back with my bundle of papers and said, okay, I found what I was looking for, and I'm going on and on about how I went through the records and how I found this stuff, and I was so proud. And my grandmother looked at me and she said, you didn't ever ask me about my family. And I said, well, you know, I was into this whole patriarchal mindset where I was just trying to find Pawpaw so I could get that side, and then I could come and ask you, so why don't you tell me about your family? I don't want to talk about it. Remember that song from The Wiz, You Can't Win? Anyway, so my aunt, the elder, the proper one, who should have gone to Harvard, but went to Fayetteville State Teachers College, because my grandfather worked 3 jobs to make sure all of his children and grandchildren went to college. He worked in a mill, he drove a cab, and he cleaned lawyers' offices at night. I remember one time asking him if I could go with him to clean. He said, you ain't never cleaned in no offices. Wouldn't let me go. But my aunt was sitting there, and I know that she felt my grandmother's, you know, sort of disappointment at not being celebrated too. And she said, Mother had a wonderful voice, and she could have gone to New York to be an opera singer. But instead, she stayed here and married your grandfather. Now, that was my grandfather with a 6th grade education who left the bend of the river so he could work the shipyards and then work in the mill and then drive a cab and then clean people's offices so all of his kids could go to college. And I realized this college-educated woman who could have been an opera singer in New York stayed in this little town and married a man with a sixth-grade education and the grandson of a sharecropper because she loved him, but also because of a missed opportunity. Invoice. I realized that Mr. Benny Pitt was not the name that we were born with, not the name that came with us from wherever we were. Lost identity. Invoice. My aunt, the educated one, the proper one, the one who was just so brilliant, she should have gone to Harvard or Princeton or Smith, but she went to Fayetteville State Teachers College because she was colored in 1950 and that was what was required. Invoice. So I finally decided that I could not carry the rage of all of these things that I learned, and I tried very hard to put them aside until my grandmother continued to tell me, now that she opened up a little, about the ways that we lost things. My grandfather, she said, was an amazing golfer. Tiger Woods amazing. But the only golf course in this little town of 10,000 people, 10,000 there then, 10,000 there now, one golf course, and it was only for white people. But he got to go on it so that he could teach the white businessmen to play. But he could never play himself. He could never go on his own. He could not play with his friends. Lost opportunity. Invoice. So I decided at that point, I cannot let anger rule me. I'm going to go to a white college, the only person in my family to do so. We went to every HBCU in the state of North Carolina. My brother went to Elizabeth City State. My sister went to North Carolina A&T. My aunt went to Fayetteville State. My mother went to North Carolina Central. My cousin went to Winston-Salem State. We went to every black college. I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm a Tar Heel. And I went because it was the best school in the state. They had a journalism school, and because I was damned if they were going to keep me out. And my grandfather said, that's where you're going to go. And my junior year, I got accepted for this amazing once-in-a-lifetime internship at the News and Observer in Raleigh, the state capital, the big paper, the big time. Problem is, Chapel Hill is over here. And Raleigh, the state capital where the paper was, is over here, 40 miles. And nobody in my family owned a car except my grandfather. So I got on the bus, which is the way that we went home every weekend. And I went home and I climbed in the bed, and it was a Friday night, and everybody goes to the football game at the one high school in my little hometown with 10,000 people. And I didn't go. I put the covers over my head. I said, my life is over. I'm never going to be a reporter. I don't have a career. I'm done. My grandfather said, what's wrong with you? I told you that's how he talks to people. And I said, I'm not going to be able to do what I went to Carolina to do. I can't take this job. I'm not going to be able to work at a paper. I'm not going to be able to get clips so I can, show them to people and get another job, and that's how that works. And so I'm just going to go work at the gas station. I'm done. He walked right off, and everybody went to the game, and I stayed in the bed. Well, the next morning, Saturday morning, you're sleeping in, right? You're a college student. It was like early, and he knocked on my door. Get up. Go outside, see whose car that is in front of our house. I said, but Papa. And that's all I said, because when Benny Pitt told you to do something, the first thing you did was said, how quickly do I have to do it? And the second is nothing. You don't say anything else. So I put on my robe, padded outside to the front of our house, and there, parked at the curb, was a used 1974 Ford Maverick, clean as a whistle with nothing inside, nothing in the glove box, nothing in the trunk, nothing to let me know anything about it except it was sitting there. I said, there's nothing in the car, Papa. I don't know whose car this is. Now you can get to work. And he walked in the house while I stood there and cried. As I now realize, and have realized for some time from that moment, my grandfather is owed all of those invoices. Those are bills unpaid. But what he did for me was to make sure that I did not have to focus on the bills that were owed me. I did not have to worry about what I didn't get because America did not do what it was supposed to do after enslavement. He worked very hard to change for 2 generations to make sure we didn't have to live the way that he did or live with those unpaid bills. And when people say things to me like, oh, you know, black people can do great. Look at Will Smith. Will Smith is doing good. How his life got turned upside down. And Oprah Winfrey, you know, she's doing great. You get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. And I look at them like, are you crazy? My grandfather could have been and was not allowed to be. Invoice. So don't point to the exceptions who managed to do well anyway and think that that's still not a debt that hasn't been paid. That is a debt that is still owed. So don't look at me because I'm not talking to you about what you owe me. I'm not owed as much as somebody else because my grandfather saw to it. You still owe him. But everything I am is because of him. I am his dividend. I am his investment. When I was inducted into the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame, that was because of Mr. Benny Pitt. When I was inducted into the North Carolina Journalism Hall of Fame, that was because of Mr. Benny Pitt. When I helped win a Pulitzer Prize, that was because of Mr. Benny Pitt. When I won the Ida B. Wells Award 2 years ago, that was because of Mr. Benny Pitt. When I won the National Headliner Award twice, that was because of Mr. Benny Pitt. And now, every single thing that I do, every single part of my life that is successful is because of Mr. Benny Pitt. I want you to say his name, Mr. Benny Pitt. He is still owed. I'm Rochelle Riley. Thank you.
Rochelle Riley, ladies and gentlemen. And please get her book, The Burden. The Burden.